Prosecutors will continue to call their witnesses today as Derek Chauvin's murder trial enters its second week. Last week, George Floyd's final moments were played out from multiple angles with bystanders, experts, and police recounting what they knew. This week, prosecutors are expected to spend their time questioning more law enforcement officials, including Minneapolis's police chief. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News legal expert and analyst Rikki Klieman. Rikki, last Monday, as you know, each side outlined its strategy in the trial. I'm very curious now. We got a little bit of a preview from Mr. Nelson, the defense counsel, when he suggested in his opening remarks that Derek Chauvin did everything that he was taught to do. But you heard all the witnesses for the prosecution saying that didn't happen, and we're expecting to hear from the police chief who's going to say that also didn't happen. So how big of a task? I know that, and people should also know that when the prosecution is calling witnesses, everybody thinks, wow, like slam dunk, like everybody up there who's talking so far is laying out the case, and it sounds pretty logical to me. But we know, of course, that once the defense starts to bring in their experts, that a lot of what we heard last week will be refuted. So how do you refute all of what we've heard from some of these folks, including what we expect to hear from the police chief?
I think what we have to remember, Vlad, from the defense point of view, is that they are looking for one juror. The prosecution has to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense only has to connect with one juror who would be willing to acquit in order to have a hung jury, which then becomes a victory for the defense because perhaps they could work out a plea rather than go through a second trial. So in their search for one juror, will their experts that they apparently will bring out in their own case in chief, keeping in mind the burden of proof is on the prosecution, beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense has no burden whatsoever. But you could surely tell from the defense opening statement that they do intend to offer expert testimony. So going to your direct question having to do with how do you overcome the witnesses from the police department who have said that the amount of force was excessive, it was unnecessary, because you had someone who was already handcuffed, who was prone on the ground, and who no longer represented any kind of a threat. And we can assume, Vlad, that the chief of police of all witnesses is going to say the same thing: excessive, unnecessary, but most important here, the chief is going to tell what the training is in that department, what he expects from his officers in following that training. I assume, Vlad, that when Derek Chauvin brings forth his witnesses, that they will say that the training was not what the government said it was. And of course, we always have that $60,000 question, which is Derek Chauvin himself going to testify about what his training was and what his intent was?
And over the course of the week, we heard from multiple witnesses, Rikki, and many of them revealed this shared sense of trauma over the events that took place on May 25th, 2020. Many of them broke down on the stand. You heard over and over again the sense of guilt that many of them had. Many times, according to the pool reports, the jury was intently looking at these individuals, at these witnesses. One juror had to leave the room at one point. You have been involved in selecting juries. You know what to look for. You know what you don't want on a jury. What kind of impact does this testimony, in your experience, what kind of impact does it have on jurors?
If a witness is simply emotional, it may have little or no impact on a jury when they go into the jury room, because they will then be looking at facts. But these witnesses were not merely emotional. These witnesses were fact witnesses. They are the eyewitnesses to the death of another human being. So they talked about what they saw, about what they heard, about what they said to attempt to have the police stop doing what they were doing, and in particular, Derek Chauvin. that they told the police that he was going to die, that he wasn't breathing, that they pleaded with the police to get the police off of George Floyd's neck. So these are different witnesses than the simple emotional witness. So they become powerful, almost a permutation of strength. That is, if someone like me, who is pretty jaded for having tried cases for decades and then covered them for decades for television, if I have to look away, if it becomes excruciating for me, and I can look away, you can look away, the viewers can look away, the jurors cannot look away. They must take a look hard at these witnesses. All these witnesses are in pain because they saw a man literally expire in front of them, and they're all living with survivor's guilt. So I think the testimony is powerful beyond words.
We talked about the witnesses who spoke specifically about the training that Derek Chauvin may have received in an effort to sort of counter what we're expecting to hear from defense counsel, including Richard Zimmerman, who is Minneapolis' longest-serving police officer. He was at the scene at Cup Foods after Floyd's death. He told prosecutors kneeling on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes was, quote, totally unnecessary. We are expecting to hear more police testimony, Rikki. Do you recall the last time you heard police officers testifying against their own?
Yes, actually. I have heard legal experts everywhere on this case talk about that this is piercing the thin blue line. Let me explain something to the viewers. When we talk about the thin blue line, or the line of silence, the blue code of silence, that usually has to do with the fact of police officers who are involved together at a time when one of the police officers does something wrong and the other police officers refuse to say anything that will implicate that police officer. We have had cases, as long and as far back as I can remember, where you do have people who are training experts, who are use of force experts. They may be within that department, they may be without that department, but they do come forward, be qualified as experts, and criticize police officers' action in an excessive use of force case. Now, one of the things that did happen, of course, in this case, is that what you have here are superior officers. You have a sergeant and you have a lieutenant who have been called about how a case is investigated when it is a use of force and a critical use of force. And they have said that they gave their opinion, whether or not they were appropriately qualified the way the rules of evidence have them be qualified, which they were not in this case. But in the reality, of course, they're qualified to give an opinion just on the basis of the years that they have served. What is highly unusual, I will say, is having a police chief testify. I do not recall that ever happening, at least in cases I've been involved in or cases that I have analyzed for television. So that act is extraordinary. However, let's consider the views of the police chief. He is someone who clearly, fully feels, firmly believes that Derek Chauvin's actions were so far beyond the pale and so far out of policy and outside of the training that any police officer in Minneapolis would have received, that he feels an obligation to not only doing the right thing about the death of George Floyd, but also he wants to show not only this jury, but the court of public opinion that this is not the way a Minneapolis police officer is supposed to behave. It is a highly unusual move to call him. I expect him to be a very powerful witness. He's very well thought of, by the way.
All right, we will be watching. I know you will too, Rikki. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn.